Imagine, if you will, that you are George Powell and you have spent the last couple of years and $500,000 producing a groundbreaking film called Destination Moon. You have filmed in expensive Technicolor. You have used top consultants for accuracy and employed the pinnacle of special effects, all to create the best vision possible of what spaceflight will be like. Your movie is now on the verge of release, and the production company has successfully run a major campaign for several months preparing the public for your innovative, never seen before masterpiece. But all this stress means that, well, around May 1950, you probably want to take in a movie for fun. Maybe the musical Annie Get Your Gun, which would fit the timescale. So you settle down with your popcorn and the trailers start. What the Basney? It's your film, Destination Moon, that people have been reading and talking about. What the hell is this piece of excrement? Greetings and felicitations. I'm Mark Hempsel, the rocket scientist of the title, but more accurately, I'm an astronautical systems engineer, and I'm on a quest to explore how space films influence our perception of real space and space flight. So in this video, I'm going to look at Rocketship XM, and what we have here is an example of the phenomena of movie twins. That is, two films on a very similar subject that are independently produced and apparently unaware of each other, but come out at the same time. It must be a real thing, because there's a Wikipedia page on the subject. Now, of course, space films are not immune to this phenomenon, and we shall see several examples as my technical trashing of space film project progresses. In most cases, how these pairings occur is a bit of a mystery. There's something in the zeitgeist that means two teams end up working on the same subject and finding out about each other when it's too late. But in this case, there is a well-documented history as to how it happened. George Powell's Destination Moon had been in production for 2 years, and that wasn't a secret. Indeed, there had been a mass of pre-release publicity to create the appetite for a space film with a post-war aesthetic. So some despicable oink called Robert Lippert hired a director, Kurt Neumann, to create a competing film. This rip-off was filmed in just 18 days with a budget of a mere $94,000 and was released on the 26th of May 1950, 25 days ahead of Destination Moon, thus snatching the honour of being the first movie space adventure since the war. We have seen the film's trailer makes a big thing about you've read about it, you've talked about it, now see it. But of course, Rocketship XM was not even in production 2 months earlier. What the great unwashed had been reading and talking about was Destination Moon. So this is a deliberate and premeditated stealing of George Powell's thunder with an out-and-out mockbuster. A mockbuster being a quick and dirty and most importantly cheap movie made to exploit the publicity and general hype of a major production. And it must be a thing because there's a Wikipedia page on the subject. And the trailer is brazenly highlighting its mockbuster credentials. And I would argue that this is a particularly egregious example, as it's not just riding the zeitgeist, but blatantly pretends to be the blockbuster itself. It was written, produced and directed by the aforementioned Kurt Neumann, which no doubt saves money and reduces the risk of creative differences. Well, that's not quite true. Hidden in the also-ran credits is a certain Orville Hampton, whose main contribution to humanity was writing scripts for B-movies. But there was also a third, uncredited writer, Dalton Trumbo, who contributed most of the Mars scenes at the end of the film. Trumbo had some real class here, as he wrote the stories and screenplays for many Oscar-winning movies, including 2 personal wins for his stories. But with such a superstar writer, why is he uncredited? And for that matter, why couldn't he openly get his 2 Oscars? Well, Dalton Trumbo was one of the Hollywood 10, a group of actors, directors and screenwriters who refused to answer impertinent and unconstitutional questions from the House Committee on Un-American Activities, led by Joseph McCarthy. An excellent lesson from history on governmental abuse of Americans' constitutional rights, should any future administration want to follow this fine example of the practice. So, at the time Rocketship was being made, Trumbo was on the Hollywood blacklist and thus unable to openly get work. And also, he was on the verge of serving time in prison for contempt of Congress, which, to be fair, he himself claimed to be guilty of because he didn't think very highly of that particular august institution after his appearance before them. Lippert and Neumann are the 2 who would definitely have known of Trumbull's involvement. But whether they were being sympathetic to his dire situation and wanted to help him out, or whether they just saw an opportunity to get some top quality writing on the cheap, is not recorded. But Lippert was well known for his economy. For example, he often employed named actors whose studio contracts had run out. So my cynical mind thinks probably the latter. But Trumbull's contribution does make a noticeable difference. Before the landing on Mars, we're well into B-movie material, with cliched soap opera dialogue, stereotypical characters, and a going-nowhere melodrama plotline. On Mars, we get some substance, with the first movie to explore the consequences of full-scale atomic war, and we have a surprising and definitely not B-movie ending. Yes, on Mars we find a destroyed civilization where only Max Factor makeup and top quality coiffure seems to have survived. So if you start watching this movie, then stick it out to the Mars scenes. It does get better, even if it cannot ever rise to the dizzying heights of actually being good. By the way, note the sepia colouring to indicate that they were on Mars. This was a Lippert speciality for his more prestigious productions, as a budget alternative to Technicolor. So Rocketship XM is at the same time both a typical Lippert picture production and its most famous. Robert Lippert was deliberately making budget features that could be rented at lower cost to the sort of cinemas that he owned, which he felt was a gap in the market that Hollywood in general was missing. In 1962, Lippert himself quoted a saying, "Lippert makes a lot of cheap pictures, but he never made a stinker." And that pretty much sums up Rocketship XM. It looks cheap, it's not outstanding, but it's not a stinker. It's a film that should have just faded into history without leaving any cultural trace. But it didn't. This ethically dubious, exploitative slice of mediocrity did not go gently into the night as all right-thinking folk would have hoped and expected. It had a massive cultural impact, but to explore that I'm going to have to put on my rocket scientist hat and look at its, for want of a better word, technical content. We do know the primary source for the technical content. It was an article in the very high-profile Life magazine. It was written in early 1949 by an illustrator, so he was not a writer nor a technical expert. But that said, its 3 short paragraphs are accurate enough. But clearly the main objective here was to fill 7 pages with Mr. Sickles' artwork depicting a speculative flight to the moon, essentially giving Rocketship XM its concept artwork. The 2-stage spaceship in Rocketship XM is a very close copy of the Life article, both inside and out. Although at takeoff it actually turns into a fuzzy shot of a real V2, or should I say it did. The rights to this movie were bought in the 1970s and the new owner shot some replacement footage to cover up the more egregiously jarring and not so special effects, making the movie a little more palatable and thus more sellable. That is the version that you would be viewing if you get to see it today. As an aside, I wonder if Rocketship XM was the only project to be influenced by the Life article.
X minus 17 minutes.
The film starts just 17 minutes before launch, with the crew finishing their medical checkout. That's just enough time to fit in a quick press conference, which, to be fair, is a good device for getting in some serious exposition dumping, but it's hardly realistic. The countdown can be heard in the background to build up the tension, but in this world there are 90 seconds to the minute, which helps our intrepid crew get to Rocketship XM's entrance hatch with 5 minutes to spare. The rocket takes off, and we get the by now obligatory crew suffering an extraordinary high G load shot, and then once they're in space we get the merest nod to microgravity, with effects that are marginally less convincing than my Taylor Swift impression. So this film was produced in a matter of weeks, made by, and let's be honest here, people who are not rocket scientists, and clearly did not have time for much technical research, so the script has many fundamental mistakes.
If it's darkness you want, wait till we enter outer space, the realm of perpetual night.
Actually, in deep space, it's always day. That's why solar panels work.
Since the gravitational attraction of Mars is only half as powerful as that of Earth, a thrust of 1,200 tons will be sufficient to make the landing. We're getting deeper in interplanetary space. Gravity will soon be practically non-existent. Look! After we have climbed through the atmosphere, we will turn the rocket into a parallel course with the surface of the Earth. In flying parallel with the Earth's surface, we receive added boost from its rotation.
Overall, the movie reveals an understanding of astrodynamics that's a little lower than the British national curriculum expects of a 12-year-old. And in addition to the out-and-out mistakes, we have glorious, meaningless technobabble, particularly when it comes to the propellant mixes for the engines.
At differential 6 over m to the 30th power, the halfway check result is 262,000 to 341,000, both using tangent E, correct?
We have to add 12% O3 to A16.
Right. 12% O3 to A16.
12% O3 to A16.
12% O3 to A16.
Our chart deviation is 32 degrees.
The reason Miss Van Horn is making this trip is because of her pioneering research with monatomic hydrogen. It enabled her to develop the first rocket fuel, powerful and concentrated enough to make this flight possible.
What? Wait, how did that slip in? Monatomic hydrogen is a real thing, and it would make a fabulous rocket propellant. Hydrogen is the simplest element, one proton surrounded by one electron. But a single atom is really desperate to be teamed up, so the natural form of hydrogen is two atoms in a stable relationship. Well, that is until they meet a seductive oxygen atom and get into the ménage à trois that we call water. And it's this reaction that is used by hydrogen-oxygen rockets like the Space Shuttle and Ariane. But if we could store hydrogen in its monatomic form, the energy of the reaction when they join up to make hydrogen molecules is massive, and the low molecular weight of the hydrogen molecule means this has a very high performance potential, way beyond chemical rockets and even beyond most nuclear rockets. So if it's so good, why doesn't it get used in real rockets? Well, there are three problems. 1, how to make it. 2, once you've made it, how to store it. And 3, how to stop it exploding, for example, as soon as it meets the engine's propellant pumps. And nobody has come even close to solutions to any of these problems. So if this young woman has solved it, we're talking about greatest of all time levels of genius. Here we see inside the engine bay with the propellant tanks. They do look rather small given the mass of the ship, which is stated as being many thousands of tons, so at the very least the tanks must contain many hundreds of tons of propellant. And here for comparison, other sizes of spherical tanks carrying just 100 tons of propellants. I guess that we should be grateful that we have any tanks at all, As later movie spaceships seem to have evolved out of these vestigial components, I guess as they don't seem to be very important. Well, here we see tanks for oxygen, hydrogen and the mysterious A in all its various forms. But the production designers do not seem to have got the memo on monatomic hydrogen. But they do seem to have included an ozone tank. So ozone is another potential superpropellant. Mixed with hydrogen instead of oxygen, it could take the exhaust velocity to over 5 kilometers a second. Not quite the performance offered by monatomic hydrogen, but it's not to be sneezed at. So why don't we use ozone? After all, we can make it. But the problems are, we don't know how to store it in a usable form, or to stop it exploding when it hits things like, well, propellant pumps. Now, while some fundamental mistakes and inconsistent technobabble might be expected from a group of scientific illiterates with only a week or two to do the research, and of course this being in the days before Google, but even taking that into account, the writers must have had some other issues to create this confused hot mess of a dialogue that is in this movie.
It's like I picked the wrong week to quit drinking.
It wasn't just that they got things wrong. They also got creative, inventing things to make space more dangerous than it actually is. Take this scene.
Meteorites!
This seems to have been dreamed up by the screenwriters, as I do not know of any previous film that has depicted this sort of threat. Although in written science fiction, the misconception that the asteroid belt is full of closely spaced large rocks that need to be dodged by intrepid spacecraft was well established. The crew call them meteorites, which is wrong. They're either meteoroids or, more reasonably at this size, asteroids. But more of a problem is that it is not possible for rocks to fly in formation like this, not in the asteroid belt or anywhere else. Now, the screenwriters might be getting confused with meteor showers, which is what happens when the Earth flies through the orbit of a comet, intersecting the dispersing dust that has been ejected alongside the gases, thus creating meteors when they hit the Earth's atmosphere. But these showers are mostly particles that are between dust and pea size, each separated by hundreds of kilometres, hardly what's depicted here. Yet despite the gross inaccuracy of this trope, it is continually repeated in later space films. Even 2001 cannot resist. But this is where this misconception starts. Real space is not as dangerous as shown in the movies. Or for that matter, as NASA public statements often suggest, where they're just following the movie fairy space lead. But one thing you do have to get right in real spaceflight are your sums, and the consequences of not listening to the most competent person in the crew can be dire. Twice in the film, the lovely Dr. Von Horn has the temerity to query the fuel calculations of the great Dr. Ekstrom, and she's dismissed with some epic world-class sexism that even in 1950 must have grated.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
For what? For momentarily being a woman? It's completely understandable, Miss Van Horn. Now, shall we go ahead?
Yes. We never proved them by experiment.
The mathematical theory is beyond question.
O3, though. Sometimes it behaves unpredictably.
Woman's intuition again?
I'm sorry, let me try and understand this. You have someone capable of developing the technology for controllable monatomic hydrogen, and you're questioning her maths. Now, if I have to pick between someone who seems to have got his knowledge of orbital mechanics from the back of a cornflakes box and literally does not know night from day, and someone who has demonstrated she's one of the greatest physicists and engineers of all time, I'm going with the brainy bint. Now, to be fair to the film's story, they do get into serious trouble for ignoring her concerns, and as a consequence, they miss the moon. Oops. but instead end up reaching Mars, which is good news for the special effects budget, as Mars is so much easier to fake on Earth than the Moon.
Unbelievable. It couldn't be mere chance.
And here, for the first time, the great Dr. Ekstrom says something that I agree with. It is quite unbelievable. That is, I do not believe it, even as a story premise. Here is the Earth and Moon to scale, and the secondary tray is pretty much the size of the Moon's orbit, so you can see the journey that Rocketship is trying to make. And here is Mars to scale. To help get the scale of the journey to Mars, I've enlisted the help of Maggie and Neil. Now, if you are looking at the Sun and thinking, is that bigger than the Moon's orbit? Well, then you would be right. If the Earth was at the centre of the Sun, the orbiting Moon would still be inside it. And what with it being so hot and all, it is fortunate that the Sun is very far away, 55 metres away on this scale where Maggie is. Mars is also a long way off, where Neil is, 29 metres away, but this is only when it is at its closest. That 2.5mm ball could be up to 140 metres away, roughly where that church tower is. And in case you were wondering where the nearest star would be on this scale, well, that would be here in Perth, Australia. So we are supposed to swallow that on a completely random trajectory they reach this 2.5mm target many tens of metres away, which, as it happens, is in a different orbital plane. Even the screenwriters seem to think that believing this might be a bit of an ask, and so they invoke the divine.
What does it mean, Doctor?
It means there are times when a mere scientist has gone as far as he can, when he must pause and observe respectfully while something infinitely greater assumes control. I believe this is one of those times.
An almost literal deus ex machina, the go-to trick when incompetent authors have painted themselves into a corner and don't have time to fix the plot.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pressed for time.
He's right, of course. I could go on, but I think I have enough to support my conclusions on the film's influence. Let's start with the music, which was provided by a certain Ferdi Grofe, which is a bit of a surprise, as this man is a respected Oscar-winning film composer of 20 years standing. So quite why a budget-conscious Lippert would hire him is a bit of a puzzle. But since only half the music has backing music, that might have helped keep the bill low. The problem, though, with hiring one of the top guys is that there is a danger that they might do something genius, and thus it came to pass here. Yes, this was the first use of the theremin in a science fiction film. It had been used occasionally on and off in film scores for a couple of decades, but Grofe used it so effectively to evoke the mystery and unknown of space that hereafter the theremin, and indeed electronic music generally, became a cliché for science fiction movies. Okay, I can see that this is a harmless legacy, but less harmless is the lack of realism that we've seen throughout the film. For example, the invention of asteroids attacking in hunting packs trope, which starts a trend of making space a more dangerous place than it actually is for the purposes of creating a more exciting adventure world. And then we have the complete disregard of orbital mechanics and the true scale of the solar system, which was not the case with the previous First Man on the Moon movies. And whereas with Destination Moon, the movie makers had at least a rudimentary understanding about how rockets actually work, with Rocketship XM, it assumes that rockets are just a piece of magic that can do whatever the plot requires. And that lead has been followed by space movies ever since. I find it difficult to have sympathy for such a blatant and shameless exploitation of another film's investment, but trying to be fair, and despite the pseudo-technical stuff ends up being a dreadful mishmash of misunderstanding and ignorance, it is a better film than might be expected. The overall story is a bit of a nothing burger, but for 1950 it had novelty, and at least some effort had been made to make it worthwhile use of 77 minutes of the audience's time. But it's hardly in the must-see category for the modern audience, but that actually is not important. The key message for Hollywood at the time was that it made a substantial profit. In percentage terms, probably more than Destination Moon, with a lower financial commitment. And money talks. When we get to considering later space movies, we shall see the consequence of the way this film greatly blurs the distinction between a serious space movie and a space fantasy. Indeed, I would argue that here is the start of modern fairy space, the fantasy genre assumptions used by all space movies, regardless of artistic intent. And for this sin, may the production team burn in hell for all eternity.